All right, everyone. This video is basically going to be my guide to the MCAT, what I did and what my recommendations are. I've been getting a lot of questions from old classmates and family friends and stuff for how I approached the MCAT. So I honestly got tired of answering everyone's questions individually. So I thought I would make a video that I could just send them, and I figured I might as well upload it to YouTube. And if someone else comes across it and finds it useful, even better. So I want to preface by saying that this is just my guide. There's a lot of these out there. People have pretty similar approaches overall. And then there's some things that vary person to person. So I definitely don't want people to take this as the only one way to approach this test. This has just worked for me, and these are just some of the tips that I have been sharing with others when anyone ever asks me how I approach this test. So a little bit about my exam. I studied for about 11 weeks. I took it March 24th of this year. I'm applying this cycle. Oops. And I'm actually working on secondaries right now, and I got kind of tired of them, so I needed a break, which is why I'm doing this. But yeah, so a really big thing I want to point out is that I wasn't employed, and I had graduated, so I wasn't taking classes. I was mostly involved in some volunteer work and doing some research, but all of it was really flexible. And everyone I was working with was aware that like these 2 months that I was really focusing on the MCAT, I wouldn't have too much time. So I think that's a really big deal. Later, I'll talk a little bit about how to approach your timeline. And again, I had the privilege of not having to work and have a lot of other commitments. I wasn't in class, so that was definitely a big plus. I studied for about, I'd say, 5 to 7 hours per day, but that definitely wasn't continuous. It was more like 30 to 40 minutes of studying and then take a little break, go on a walk, play some games, watch some videos, and then get back to it. So if you wanted to consider the actual amount of time I was studying, it was probably closer to 4.5, 5 hours per day. Um, Again, I had finished for college, so I'd taken all my prereqs. I did never take anatomy, physiology, psych, or soc in college, and you can kind of see that reflected in my score. My lower sections are the ones where those subjects are applicable. But yeah, that's just a little bit about myself. I guess I'll talk about this more later, but it might be useful to know that my full length exam average was a few points below what I actually ended up scoring. And I'll talk about why that was and more about full length exams too. But and then my blueprint diagnostic, which I'll talk about it as well. It's not the most useful thing, but it's another indicator. That was a 509, and I took that about a month before my actual test. And then my UWorld percentage was around a 71 or 72. So those numbers, I think, I get compared a lot online. And so I figured I'd share mine as they compared to this test. So the MCAT, you really want to approach it in three phases, is how I like to refer to it. So the first one is obviously content review. The second one is third-party practice, and the third phase is official prep. And I'll go in depth into what each of these meant for me. But you can kind of pause the video and read anything I write at any point. I'm not going to read out every single thing in this kind of PowerPoint. You can see that I'm not very tech savvy, so I don't know how to make those fancy videos. I'm just using Zoom to record this. But yeah, I think the first thing you need to do before starting anything is you want to set up your timeline. So this will be different for everyone. And once you have your timeline set, you can kind of stretch these phases to be as short or as long as you need. Right. So for me, my timeline was, as you can see, from about the first or second week of January all the way to my test date. So that was 10 to 11 weeks. So that was a little over 3 weeks per phase for me. Ideally, you want to study for this test for 6 to 9 months. I think that's the number I heard thrown out a lot. You can do it in 3 months. A lot of people try to do it, right after they finish their semester in May, and then they have a test date for like September, and then they study throughout the entire summer. That's pretty common. If you're working, if you're in school, then you probably want to stretch things out a little more because you're not going to have as much time to cram in that much material per day. Whereas if you were kind of in my boat and you had more time for just the MCAT, then you could maybe condense. But it's a really good idea to have either your tests booked already and registered, or kind of have a tentative idea of when you want to take your test if you are feeling nervous about actually registering, right? Like this video will probably go up early June. So if you were watching this and you wanted to take it in like October or November, you know that you have like 4 to 5 months and you can kind of, again, decide how much time you want to spend on each phase. So the timeline is really important. Prerequisites, these are huge. I've been talking to a lot of people recently who are like sophomores or even freshmen who are thinking about taking this test soon. And they've completed like 1 semester of bio and 1 semester of Gen Chem, and they're kind of going for it. Smart people exist, and it's possible to study for this test and do well without these classes, but I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's really important to have a lot of these courses done, if not all these courses done, before you really start studying for the MCAT. I realize that for traditional applicants, people who are planning on applying after their junior year so they can start medical school right after they finish senior year, that may not be completely possible. So from this list, I definitely recommend biochemistry. I think is actually, let me take that back. I think the ones that are absolutely required are 2 semesters of Gen Chem, 2 semesters of OChem, and cell bio up here. I think those are critical. I would not recommend anyone study for this test without taking those courses, because that material is, frankly speaking, foundational to pretty much everything on this test. The next one I would recommend the most would actually be genetics. I think the genetics is tested on the MCAT. It's not too high yield, but it shows up. But the way genetics works, it's a very different type of class. If you've ever taken genetics after like taking cell bio or something, it's like math biology. It's a lot of statistics, it's a lot of probability. It's a very different way of learning, and those fundamentals show up throughout the MCAT a lot. After genetics, I would recommend biochem. I think you can go into this test without having studied biochem if your foundation in OChem and Gen Chem is really strong, and cell bio, because biochemistry for me, it was just kind of putting all those three together. So if you're good in these three subjects, you can kind of figure your way out by using other content, but I definitely recommend having biochem done. And then microbiology and immunology was one that was really helpful for me. It was a class I took the semester before. So I graduated December of 22. So it was the class I took semester before taking the MCAT. And the MCAT does have a little bit of microbiology, a little bit about antibodies and stuff, and B cells and T cells for immunology stuff. But again, the principles that you learn in this class and the way you learn to think about different body systems and stuff, that's very helpful. And then again, I never took anatomy, physiology, psych, or soc, and it definitely hurt me. There were times when I was self-studying and it was difficult. So I would recommend taking psychology or sociology in college. That's a mistake that I would have changed if I could go back, especially because a lot of medical schools actually want you to have some behavioral science exposure. So this is kind of a 2-for-1. And then anatomy and physiology, it's on there as well. And you can self-study it like I did, but if you have time to take it in your course schedule, I would definitely recommend it. And then finally, try to sort out your other commitments. Again, I said sort out rather than eliminate, because you can't, like, if you're working to support yourself, you obviously can't eliminate that. And so it's more just like, once you have your timeline set, try to talk to your employer, or, if you're doing research, and, if you can get a little lighter of a load for the next couple of months, that's great. If not, maybe, just let them know that you're going to be working on this big thing, and whatever flexibility you're able to get, the more the better. And then again, try to get rid of anything unnecessary. If there's like a really cool volunteer opportunity coming up that you really want to do. If it's like a once in a year thing, that's understandable, go for it. But if it's something that kind of comes around seasonally, maybe hold off on it until the MCAT's over. So just kind of have an idea of these three topics, and kind of think through them before you really sit down and start studying. I wanted to really quickly talk about Reddit, because a lot of what I'm going to recommend comes off of Reddit, and like the materials and stuff I'm going to suggest. The r/MCAT, or the MCAT subreddit, I guess it's called, is very useful. It's there's a lot of stuff out there. People discuss questions. People make like community materials, which are pretty much what I used entirely, besides a few like prep services. So, or not prep services, but like question pack services. Um, there's a big concern that Reddit and SDN and stuff are toxic and can be difficult to navigate, which is true. But my thing is, just the pros outweigh the cons. So I think if you can get comfortable using Reddit and this subreddit specifically, and navigating through and finding those materials, you're going to see dumb stuff pop up here and there. Someone's going to be complaining about how they got a 527 and they feel like a failure, and it's just look past that stuff. Don't avoid Reddit completely. I think it is really helpful for stuff like this. So you can find a lot of material. Okay, so the first phase, content review. This includes your prereq courses. I think do well in classes. If you're like a freshman watching this or something, like classes can feel like a burden sometimes, and especially lecture courses, 300 student lecture courses, which is what my university had, for example. But it's all the same material, right? So try to focus on them. Once you actually start studying for the MCAT, again, based on your timeline, this should be about 33% of the time you spend studying for the MCAT, right? The first portion. So for me, I use something called Chats Prep. I hope me mentioning like official companies and stuff doesn't get me like copyrighted. I don't know how YouTube works, but I'm promoting them, so I hope I'm not. This is not like a paid advert, but this is what I used, and they were super helpful. So this is basically a guy who recorded a bunch of videos about a whole bunch of topics, including MCAT science videos, and it's really great. They're like 10 to 15-minute videos, and then he has a little like self-made quiz right at the end of the video that has like 10 to 15 questions that tests you on your material. So Chad's prep, I think, is perfect for MCAT revision because he doesn't go super into detail with like every little thing. But he covers everything you need to know for the sciences. So it's that very good balance. Like I mentioned Khan Academy here. Khan Academy is really good, but sometimes they get super granular and they get kind of carried away. And they go super in depth into topics. And it's like you don't need that completely for the MCAT, right? You want to more cover everything, but you don't need to be super deep. So Chad's prep does a great job of that. YouTube videos again are great. There's this biochemistry pathways video or a biochemical pathways video by the channel called Science Simplified. I'll put a link to it in the description for this video. Again, I hope like me mentioning a specific YouTube channel doesn't get this video pulled down, but it's a 30-minute video where this guy literally speed runs through every biochemical pathway you need to know for the test, and it's fantastic. I would watch it like once every 2 or 3 nights, just like before bed. It was amazing. And you can find a bunch of other really good YouTube videos that cover specific content as well. Again, Reddit has a lot of fantastic stuff. The 3 specific ones that I recommend are there's a mnemonics Google sheet someone made. And then the Mile Down review booklet. I think it's around 80 pages or something, and it's got just like a crash course of every single topic. And then there's that famous 100-page Psych Soc doc. This is what I use to basically study the entire subject. Because again, I never took those classes. So, and for each of these 3, if you just like look them up in Reddit, they should pop up really quickly because these are so commonly used. So yeah, and then I would recommend sticking to these 3 just during the content review phase. There's going to be a lot of other stuff you're going to find, and I'll recommend using them later as you progress. But for now, you should just use these. And then I guess I should have started with this, but how much do you need to know? I think it's important to remember that the MCAT is a mile wide and an inch deep. So what that means is they basically want you to know a little bit about everything. And that really goes back up to like Chad's prep and what I was saying about Khan Academy. You don't need to know like every little detail about these topics, but you need to know a little bit about a lot. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind when you're studying for this thing. Do you need to know every biochemical pathway? That was like a really common question I kept coming across, and even I had this when I was studying. Like, do you need to know every single enzyme, every single intermediate? In my opinion, no. I think if you understand the basic idea of what's going on, that's really helpful. So this biochem video again does a really great job of that. He doesn't go through and like just spit a bunch of enzymes and intermediates at you. He tells you how different molecules that connect all the pathways together, how they fit together. So pyruvate is a really good example, right? It's the end product of glycolysis. And where does pyruvate go? What does it filter into? What pathways does it feed into? What can pyruvate be used to make, and what can be used to make pyruvate? that's more of the stuff you want to be thinking about. Um, what else? Let's see. I think the only exception to that rule is you should know the rate limiting enzymes for most of the big pathways. I've already forgotten them. I think it's like PFK1 is one of the important rate limiting enzymes for glycolysis or something like that. Like those key enzymes, like 2 to 3 per pathway, it's important to know. But again, the bigger idea, the more important point is to know the general flow of how things fit together. And this video does an excellent job of that. You'll see what I'm talking about once you watch it. And then do you need to know every little physics topic? Physics was my weakest subject going into the MCAT from my own assessment. I wasn't good at college physics. Do you need to know everything? I don't think so. I think you need to more know equations, and I'll mention some of my tips at the very end of this video. But unit conversions, I'll talk about it later. But do you need to know everything? No. I think if you're feeling comfortable with how to use equations and unit conversions, you'll be pretty good. So yeah. So the second kind of phase is third-party practice. Once you feel good about your content, once you feel like you've covered all your bases, you've spent like a month, 2 months studying and kind of watching videos and building up your background. Really quick, I want to mention here, I forgot, a lot of people use like the Kaplan review books. I personally didn't find them helpful just because it was like dry reading for me, and I wasn't doing much for that. But if you're finding them useful, include them in here as well. But yeah, back to practice. So practice is the big thing. UWorld, again, I hope I don't, get attacked for mentioning specific companies, but UWorld is the big one you'll hear. And they're fantastic. I think they're the only like thing aside from official AAMC stuff that you have to pay for. Besides maybe Chats Prep if you decide to use it. I think they're pretty affordable and they're worth it. I think it is slightly expensive, but you get 3,000 plus questions. They're adding more. I think right now they're up to like 3,500, and they have like MCAT style questions for every single topic on the test, every single subject area, and they're fantastic. So the great thing about UWorld is that every question has a detailed explanation. So regardless of if you get it right or wrong, you can get an explanation for that includes like a quick background on what the question is. So if the question was like if it was a classic physics question, like there's a ramp and there's a box at the top of the ramp, how long will it take the box to come down or something like that? Like UWorld's explanation will give you a quick background on that topic, which is like gravity and ramps and friction and everything that's applicable there. And then it'll explain why the right answer was right and why each of the wrong answers were wrong. And again, remember the MCAT is a multiple choice test, so it's like 4 options per question, right? So they'll tell you why the right one was right and why the other 3 ones that were wrong were incorrect. So UWorld is fantastic. They have 2 modes in which you can do the questions. They have like a timed mode and a tutor mode. The timed mode is kind of like a real exam where it gives you questions and then you answer them. And at the very end, once you're finished with the set, it tells you how many you got right. And then you can go back and review them. My personal recommendation, and this is, I think, slightly controversial advice because most people don't do it this way. I recommend sticking to tutor mode, which is that as soon as you click an answer to a question, immediately it tells you if it was right or wrong, and it brings up the whole explanation. So for this phase, which is you're practicing how to answer MCAT related questions, you're applying your content and actually assessing your content for the first time. I think having that tutor mode where you immediately find out what did you do right, what did you do wrong is really helpful. The nice thing about tutor mode in UWorld is it also has a little clock up at the top that just lets you know how fast you're going. And once you click your answer, it pauses the clock while you're reviewing the explanation. And then once you click next and you start answering the next question, then it resumes. So you can still kind of time yourself while you're doing it, which is what I did. So it's 2 for 1, I think. And then again, it's a lot of questions, right? So how many should you do per day? I think if you're on like a longer schedule, like a 6 to 9 month schedule, once you hit this phase, maybe 60 questions, maybe 30 questions a day, 30 to 60 questions a day is a good place to be at. And then if you have less time, maybe as much as 200. This is how much I was doing per day, just because I was on such a tight schedule. I think UWorld overall is really good for building up stamina because stamina is a big thing with this test. It can get really tiring really fast. So doing a lot of questions per day and then really focusing and building up your tolerance to a lot of study is really helpful. Another thing I'll say is the cars section, which is if you're not too familiar with the MCAT, it's that second section that's a lot of reading and critical analysis. Cars on UWorld, I think, is their weakest. Again, once you buy the subscription, you get access to everything. So definitely do it. It's not like you have to pay extra for cars or anything. I think for cars, Jack Weston down here, this is a completely free resource, and they put out a free cars passage every day. This is fantastic. So I think you should be doing a certain number of questions from UWorld every day. You can also do their cars as well, and then do the cars passage from Jack Weston every day during your phase 2. I think they also have other stuff. They also have questions for free for all the other subjects. I think UWorlds are slightly better. That's why they're expensive and whatnot. But these are also really good. That you can never get too much practice. So if you're on the bus or something and you got a couple extra minutes, whip out some Jack Weston questions and just do them. Overall for this section, or this phase, I guess, you remember that the MCAT is a passage-based exam. So it's a lot of critical thinking. Yes, content is important, but the way I like to think of it is that the MCAT is not a content-focused exam. It's a critical thinking exam that uses scientific content as its vehicle to test you. So more than testing you on the content, they're testing your critical thinking through the content. And so that's why most of the questions that you come across, except for a few discretes, are passage based. And so that's a big thing that you should be focusing on when you're doing UWorld passages is how good is your passage comprehension? Are you able to read through like 2 to 3 paragraphs of information and figure out what's going on? Also, this is where you can start to identify all the other problems you might have. Everyone has different weaknesses. Is it for you time? Again, the MCAT, remember, it's about like 60 questions in 90 minutes per section. So if you're doing 60 questions per day, and you see that it's taking you 3 hours to get through the pack, that's fine for this phase. Don't stress, but just keep in mind that time management is something that might be a weakness of yours that you're gonna have to work on. If you're getting a lot of questions wrong just because like you click what you think is the right answer and then you read their explanation and it's like, oh, I didn't even know what they're talking about, then you know that, okay, maybe your content review wasn't good enough. You need to kind of go back to phase 1 here and brush up on some of the content. And then strategy, right? Are you approaching these questions correctly? A cars question, you're going to approach it very differently than if it was a physics question. You're going to approach that very differently than if it was a biochemistry question. So make sure your strategies are okay. And then UWorld percentage, a lot of people on Reddit talk about, everyone's comparing UWorld percentages. Like I said, mine was like a 71, 72. I think if you're above a 65% and you know why you're getting your questions wrong, that's fine. Like for me, I rushed through content review. I just did chats prep. I didn't do any of this other stuff. I found this other stuff later. That's why I'm recommending you do it now. So I was at like 65 to 68% for a really long time. And it was mostly because I just didn't know some of the stuff they were asking. And so once I started to learn some of that stuff again, then my percentage jumped up a bit. So yeah, I mean, if you're anywhere around 75, then you're in really good shape, I think. So yeah. Okay. After you've done the first 2 phases, I recommend you stop, take a bit of a break, and then do these 2 exams. These are going to be your first kind of full-length style exams. So the company Blueprint, which has a lot of test prep services that a lot of people do, they have a free half length that's like 3 hours long diagnostic exam. It's really good. I think it's good to just kind of get your feet wet into what like an MCAT exam is like. Again, for this phase, you're just doing kind of isolated questions, right? Some come as passages, some come as discretes, and you're doing 30 to 60 a day and reviewing. But this might be your very first exposure to what taking the MCAT is like. So this one's 3 hours long. It's a really great introduction. And then the AAMC, which I'll talk about the official materials here, they have this unscored sample test. It's as long as a real test. You just don't get a score at the end. It just tells you how many questions you got right. But there's tons of tools online you can use to convert your number of questions you got right to like a tentative score. So both of these are really good to do after you finished phase 2, just to see where you're at, kind of see where your stamina is at. If you're like huffing and puffing halfway through the full length sample, like 3 hours in, then okay, I'm gonna have to drink more water, whatever you need to do. Or if you got through it with ease, like 7 hours later you're feeling fine, then okay, I'm in good shape, that UWorld practice paid off. So yeah, take a break for about a week, and somewhere in there kind of do these. um should you review these questions? You can kind of look through if you missed like a specific area. Like, let's say with the blueprint you got like a 120 in your chem phys section, and you got like 125s everywhere else. Okay, chemistry and physics might be my weak one, so kind of look more into there. Same with the AAMC sample. If like you got 20 questions right out of 60 in one of the sections and you did better in the others, then so I would just kind of use it to orient yourself, and not look too deep into it. Okay, phase 3, official prep. So at this point, whether this is like a month and a half out for me exam or 2 months out for me exam, I recommend that everyone should, regardless of how tight your study timeline is, everyone should be on the same timeline when they get here. I'll talk about this later too, but what I mean is that, like, even if you're studying for 3 months or if you're studying for 6 months, like, try to give yourself about a month and a half for this. So if you're studying for only 3 months, try to give yourself more time for this section. And if you're studying for 6 months, try to give yourself less time for this section, if that makes sense. I think this phase should be about 40 to 45 days for everyone. This is where everyone should come together and be on the same timeline. And this should be in the 45 days leading up to your actual exam. That was a very long-winded way of saying that, but hopefully the point got across. And at this point, you should stop everything else, or hopefully you finished everything else, and then kind of switch to AAMC stuff only. So AAMC or the AAMC, they're obviously the company that makes the MCAT, and they also make a bunch of like official practice prep stuff. So I think their entire, forgot to look, I think you can get like a whole pack of all of the stuff included for like 250 or something like that. So it is more money, unfortunately, but again, these are official materials from the makers of the exam. So this is as accurate to the real thing as you get. This is, and it's why I recommend you leave it to the end. So you get kind of 3 different materials. You get what are called the question packs. I think they have question packs for every subject. I recommend you start with these. They're the easiest in terms of the content, but they're really useful to help you get acquainted to the language, the question style, the topics that the AAMC is testing you on. So it's a really good orientation into AAMC stuff. If that sounds confusing, just keep in mind that, like, yes, the actual content of the MCAT is the same, and every one of these, like, third-party materials, Jack Weston, Blueprint, UWorld, they're all finding ways to test you on, the same scientific or behavioral content, but the language they use, the question style they use, there's little bits of differences between each kind of company. So it's really important to get used to what the AAMC does, because they're the ones who are going to write your actual exam, if that makes any sense. If it still doesn't make sense, imagine, let's go back to like a physics equation or a physics problem, right? That example I gave about the box at the top of a ramp, that is a question. Now, if you had to pose that question in terms of a word problem, if I asked 5 different people to come up with a word problem for the same physics like question, like the ramp is the same height, the box is the same weight, the ramp is the same length, even if all those numbers were the same, the 5 people would have 5 pretty different ways to write their word problem, if that makes any sense, right? Even though it's asking you the same thing, it's testing you on the same question, the way the problem is presented to you can vary. So that's why you want to get oriented to AAMC stuff, and I recommend you start with what is content-wise the easiest. So these question packs. I was around an 80 to an 85% on these. Again, higher than UWorld because they are easier. Again, don't stress too much. Just figure out if you miss something, why did you miss it? Was it content? Did the question not make sense to you? Same thing. The next one is the section banks and the cars packs. These are difficult. These are
in some sense harder than your actual exams too. These are very hard, and that's the consensus. If you look up how difficult is the section bank on Reddit, it's just a bunch of people saying, yeah, it's hard. So I was around 70 to 75%, so pretty similar to my UWorld percentage. And yeah, these are excellent. These are a gold mine. These are very good. I've heard from some people that these are questions taken directly from old exams. I don't know if that's true, but it could be. So these are very, very helpful. So again, after you finish your question packs, which I should say maybe 2 weeks, section bank should take like another 2, maybe 3 weeks. And then you want to move on to your full length exams. These should be among the last things you do, in my opinion, and you should really lock in to these. There's 5 full length exams. The fifth one is came out last year, and it's called the scored AAMC sample. It doesn't have the number 5 next to it, which is why a lot of people are confused when you say full length 5. But that one's the fifth one. Full length 5, I'm pretty sure, was confirmed to be an old test from last year. So if that tells you anything. And the other 4 also might be old exams, but no one really knows. So yeah, strategies for how to do your full length exams. It goes without saying, mimic real test conditions. So put away your distractions, set aside a time to do them. Usually, most people do them on like Fridays or Saturdays, starting at 8 a.m., just like the real thing would be. Go to the library. If you live alone, it should be fine to do it at home. But like if you live with other people, if you do distractions. For me, this was the thing that I really didn't do. I live with a bunch of people. I live at home, so my family's around. And since I had graduated from college, I still went to my school's library, but I didn't have the ability to like book a study room. So I was just kind of sitting out in the open doing these. And it's the library, so people are pretty quiet, but it still was like in the middle of the semester. It was like March, so everyone was like active, and so I was like also having to get up to like get water and stuff. So that's probably the part that I did like not very well. So I recommend not doing that if possible, trying to be as precise with your full length exams. And then kind of what I was saying before, like regardless of what your timeline is, this part, especially the full length part, should be really similar for everyone. And I like to recommend the 6 to 7 day rule. So I recommend you say, let's say you take test one on day one, which is like a Monday or whatever. Then for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, review each section. Take a day to just like in-depth review each section. So on Tuesday, you would review the chem phys part of the test you took, and then Wednesday you would do the cars part. And then on Saturday and or even Sunday, take a break and just do a little bit of light review to stay warmed up, but kind of let yourself cool down. And then the next Monday, you take full length 2. So if you stuck to like a full 6 to 7 day routine, right, you could 5 tests that can take up to like a month. You can, this is a typo, you can compress if need to. So I was on more of like a 3 to 4 day schedule. So I would take one and then I would review 2 sections per day and then take a day break and then take the next one. But be precise with these. And for these ones, unlike what I said about like your blueprint exam and the unscored sample, review literally every question, even the ones you got right, because sometimes we guess, given that it's a multiple choice test. So when you're reviewing these tests, the user interface that AMC has, you can click through and you can see which ones are right and which ones are wrong. Don't just click on the wrong ones, click on the right ones too, and go through everything. That's very important. Here I said, if after 1 or 2 full lengths, you're like, I said, if you're not scoring within 5 points of your target, but just kind of assess, right? If you want to score a 510 on the real thing and your full length average for the first and second one is like a 480, then that might be a concern, right? Like then I would say, let's stop. Let's think about what's going on. Try to figure out, again, is it a stamina issue? Is the content just like not clicking for you? And hopefully like the content stuff you should have figured out even during UWorld, right? If you're getting like a low percentage. I would be more surprised if your percentage on UWorld was okay and then you whipped through the question packs and the section banks, and then your full length started to dip. That would be then, in my opinion, that would be not a content issue, but like a stamina issue. Is it test anxiety? There could be a lot of things that cause it, but again, if after one or two full length exams you're very far from where you want to be, then I would recommend kind of reassessing and maybe taking a break. Maybe you're exhausted. There could be a lot of stuff. This also doesn't mean that if your goal is like a 515 and you got a 513, you should stop and freak out. Like again, if you're like significantly far away from where you want to be, then you should reconsider. If you're 4 or 5 points like away from where you want to be, I think you're in a really good spot. And then this is what I recommend you do the week before your exam. Okay, literally the 7 days before your exam. So this is another thing you can find on Reddit, or you can find on Kaplan's website. I think it's called a quick sheets. It's basically a very condensed review sheet for all of your MCAT topics. I would read this every day. It's about 20 pages long, and it's got a lot of little figures and stuff, and it's really nice, well crafted. It's easy to read. So I read it every single day. And then while I was reviewing my full length exams, every time I missed a question, I would just write a quick note about why I missed it. If it was like a content thing, like if I forgot, you know, oxidation versus reduction or something simple like that, I would just make a quick note. And so by the end of my 5 full length exams, I had about 15 pages of just like one liner notes. So I would just read through those every day as well. Just like a quick, it reminded me of what I missed because, again, there's a finite amount of content that the AAMC can test you on, right? And so a lot of it shows up on the full length exams. So yeah, I would really make sure that your hormones, amino acids, basic physics equations, the functional groups in OChem, logs, and this should pH calculations, but also scientific numbers or scientific notation, like 10 to the -6 power, whatever that's called. That stuff, high yield physics or not physics, psych and soc topics, and then the enzymes for glycolysis and gluconeogenesis. I think these are my suggestions for like the highest yield stuff that you should make sure is really memorized. Also find out where your test center is, what the parking situation is like, what the weather is going to be like, all that kind of stuff. And then on test day, wear warm clothes. Most test centers are weirdly cold. Make sure to bring food. Have a plan for when you want to use the restroom. For me, that was going to be after cars. I had that ready to go. I don't know why, but just like having a mental plan for like when you're going to do certain things really helps. And then eat a solid breakfast. So yeah. And then this is kind of, I don't know how to say this. I just titled it Notes on MCAT Strategies Overall. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So if you're already familiar with MCAT prep and you're watching this video, you might be surprised to hear me not have mentioned Anki even once. It's like a religious thing to do for the MCAT, and in medical school, it becomes almost a requirement. For those that don't know, Anki is a flashcard app where you can load in flashcard decks and do MCAT flashcards every day. The big idea is that doing flashcards helps with your recall, which is a really important thing to have, is being able to actively recall information. I hated Anki. I hated like waking up in the morning and seeing that I had like 600 cards to do. It was just demoralizing for me. So I deleted it. I didn't use it at all, and it seems to have worked out for me. Am I saying you shouldn't do Anki? I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you don't like Anki, don't feel bad about not using it. If you do like Anki and it's working for you, go ahead and use it. I'm very like use Anki as it benefits you kind of a person. So I'm more putting this here to again say like, if you're someone who doesn't like Anki, don't get freaked out by the fact that everyone's continuously talking about it. If it's not working for you, forget it. And if it is working for you, it's awesome if it works for you. So definitely use it. Test prep services like Blueprint, like I mentioned, they have like a $2,000 like course. Princeton probably has one. Everyone has one of these things. For me, I didn't use them. I think Reddit, Chad's Prep, UWorld, and the official materials together should be able to put you over the top, as long as you've done well in your classes. If you do all of these things, and you take your full length exams and things aren't working for you still, then if you have the money for it, you might want to look into a test prep service or like a tutor or something, just because everyone thinks differently. We're good at different things. And if some people are just poor test takers, like that, I don't know how I did well on this, but like in class in college, I would be happy if I got like an 80 or an 85 on like a science course test, just because I'm not the best test taker. So if you're a really poor test taker and that's just one of your weaknesses, then you might benefit from a test prep service. But I would recommend, especially if you have more time leading up to your exam, if you have like 6 to 9 months, do what I recommended, kind of for try these type of strategies first before dropping, $3,000 on test prep service, and take a full length exam. And if you're kind of feeling okay, then continue. And then again, if your first one or two full lengths are not where you want them to be, then I would recommend looking into a test prep service or a tutor or something. But definitely don't do it first. It's so much money, and applying is so much money, and doing that right now, so you can really save money. Remember that recognition is quicker than recall. You'll learn this when you're studying for the psych section. So here's your first lesson. Recognition is quicker than recall. The reason I include that here is because when you're studying for the MCAT, you do content review, like I said, first, and then let's say you move on to your UWorld questions. Let's say one of the things you studied in your content review was the structure of cholesterol, and the fact that membranes, like lipid membranes, it depends on like what the nature of certain molecules that can cross through your lipid membranes are. So the first time you see a question that's like, can cholesterol cross through the lipid membrane? You're going to have a little bit of recognition on it. You're going to be like, cholesterol. I remember seeing that. Is it a polar molecule? Is it non-polar molecule? And then you're going to see lipid membrane, and you're going to be like, ooh, okay. Are lipid membranes like, are the outsides polar? Are the insides polar? Like, can polar molecules cross through, or can non-polar molecules? So you're going to recognize a bunch of stuff, but you might not necessarily be able to put it together. And so you're probably going to shoot your shot and take a guess. If you get it right, great. If you don't get it right, don't stress. Just remind yourself what it is, read UWorld's explanation, and move on. The next time you get a question similar to it, which guarantee me, you're going to get a question similar to it, then you might recognize more quickly. You might be like, oh, okay, cholesterol, I remember what it is. And then, okay, lipid membranes, I remember that like non-polar molecules can cross through it only, or whatever. And then you might get closer to answering. And then, but you still might get it wrong. And then like third time's usually the charm, I say. By the third time of seeing not the exact same question, I should clarify, but a similar question, right? Like you might get a passage where it's talking about like some antibiotic, and it's like, this antibiotic is this structure, can it cross through this bacterial cell wall or whatever, something like that. So similar question. Then you might finally be able to like recall and be like, so all this is just a long way of saying, don't freak out if like the first time you see a question, you're not immediately able to pull out all the content and apply it. That's what the practice is for. That's why I recommend the second phase, which is 33% of your study time should be practice. Timing doesn't mean much in my opinion. I think as long as you're like in the ballpark, as long as you're like 100 minutes or under per section, I think you'll be fine on the real thing. I finished the real exam in like 4.5 hours, and I actually stayed for like an extra 10 minutes on the psych soc section because I was like, this is so soon, am I freaking out? But if you're finished with everything, and if timing isn't an issue for you, after you've reviewed all your flagged questions, don't stress. If you're done, you're done. Another big question, especially ones that you see on like the subreddit and on SDN, is like, what are some low yield topics? Like, is there such thing as a low yield topic? I think there is. Like the coagulation cascade, that's very low yield. It shows up like once or twice in like the entire set of practice materials, but I've heard it's shown up on people's tests. So like that's an example of like a true low yield thing. However, that doesn't mean that you should skip studying parts of content. I think when people ask, is a topic low yield, they're hoping to hear like, oh yeah, this thing that's mentioned on the AAMC outline, don't study it. And the sad part is, unfortunately, that's not true. If something is mentioned on the AAMC outline, and again, all of these test prep services that I mentioned, like UWorld, like Jack Weston, they're all based off the AAMC outline, right? They don't work for AAMC. The way they figure out what they're supposed to prepare you for is that outline. So if something's mentioned on the outline, just consider that it might show up on your test. So yeah. Unit conversions. I was kind of talking about that earlier. A super underrated part of the entire physics game for this MCAT is basically unit conversions. If you get really comfortable knowing how to convert between Faradays, joules, Pascals, Newtons, stuff like that, there's like 7 or 8 units that show up. If you can convert between those, you might be able to get like 3 out of 4 physics questions right without knowing anything about physics. Just because the physics questions you get on the MCAT, there's no calculator, right? So they have to give you a certain amount of information that you have to be able to do by hand. And like again, going back to that ramp example I keep bringing up, like they're going to have to give you the weight of the box or the height of the ramp, and they usually also give you gravity. If you don't know gravity, it's a very easy number to memorize. So if you just put all those numbers down on paper, you can, and if you know how to convert between the units, you can see what the answer choices, what units they're in, right? So if the answer choices are all in the units of newtons, then you know that you have to use the units of all the numbers you've been given to somehow get to newtons. And if you know how to do that, then stuff starts canceling and you can pretty easily figure out what to divide what by, what to multiply what by. Things go fast. So the first thing I would recommend when you start learning physics is get comfortable converting between those 7 or 8 units. It's such a like bang for your buck study strategy. I wish I'd done it earlier. Um, Cars is a big one. I was a philosophy major in college, so cars was actually my strongest section overall throughout practice, and it's usually people's weakest. So people have always asked me what car strategies I have. Um, my big ones are these three. So I think the first one is they're all like passages from like some authors writing about something, right? Like you might get a passage where it's like a magazine article where this guy was criticizing a piece of art. Like it's completely different stuff. And I've seen this like surprisingly a lot on Reddit, and people are like, should I start learning like art history and philosophy? And it's like, no, not at all. The biggest thing to do is while you're reading the passage, pretend you're the author. Like put yourself in the author's shoes and pretend you agree with everything they're saying. Try to understand their point of view. And the second point kind of goes hand in hand with that. Leave your outside knowledge away. Just pretend you don't know anything. Technically speaking, the car's passages give you all the information you need to answer the questions. So don't bring your outside information in. If you get a passage about like, okay, I don't know if I can mention it because this is on my real exam, but like I got a passage related to a form of art that my mother is trained in. That's as vaguely as I can say. And so I knew a lot about that form of art. And so a lot of the questions that were being asked were like questions about that form of art. And what I knew about that form of art often contradicted with what the passage was saying. So I had to like really focus on forgetting what I knew about it and just focus on the information that passage gave me. Because keep in mind that virtually everyone else who's taking this test doesn't know anything about that form of art, and they should theoretically be able to get a full score on that passage, right? So what that means is that everything you need to know about that form of art to be able to answer those questions is in the passage. So just leave all of your outside knowledge at the door and focus on what the passage gives you. And then finally, I think this applies to honestly the entire test. Slightly controversial piece of advice, but highlighting is a waste of time. If you don't know, the highlighter, the user interface for the MCAT has a little highlight function. Complete waste of time, I think, because if you're highlighting everything that's important, the entire passage is practically important. So I've seen people who highlight like literally basically the entire passage, like 90% of it's highlighted, and they like went through highlighting line by line, and then they look back and like literally every other line is highlighted. And it's like that's just such a waste of time. I think like those small things can add up. If you're struggling with time, like maybe stop highlighting if that's something you're doing. Um, Another thing is use your professors for help. Even if they know nothing about the MCAT, like with physics, I was really struggling with electrostatics. So I was a philosophy major, but this wasn't even my professor. I found an electrical engineering professor who was teaching like an undergrad engineering seminar that semester. And I emailed him and I was like, hey, I'm not your student, but can I come to your office hours and ask you some random questions once? And he was super nice. And so I went to his office hours with like the MCAT physics book outline. And I showed him some of the stuff and I was like, can you give me a crash course on a couple of these topics? And he explained some of the stuff so well that it was really helpful. So don't be afraid to reach out to professors that both you've taken classes from and other professors as well, and just ask them if you can ask them a couple questions if you're struggling on a particular topic. The worst thing they can say is no, right? They might be really helpful. So there's that. And then other fun ideas, get creative with it. This is like easily like the saddest thing, but also one of the most helpful things I did when I studied for the MCAT. I made like a diagram of all the biochemical pathways, and then I printed it out and I laminated it and I stuck it in my shower. So every morning when I was showering, I have nothing else to do in there, so I would just kind of like read through some of the pathways again and again. And like 2 weeks in, it really helped. I mean, hopefully you shower every day, right? And so that's an idea. There's a really fun like amino acids game app that you can get. It's like little amino acid quizzes. It's free. Do that. Um, this kind of goes into my hate for Anki, but I hate having to use my phone or my laptop for more things than necessary. So what I did was I got like some of those old index cards that we used to use in like elementary school, and then I made like a 100 card physics equation deck by hand. And wherever I was, I could like just use my hands and go through it, and that felt a lot better for me than like clicking through my phone or like my laptop for Anki. Um, and then again, there's a lot of great videos, a lot of great podcasts out there for MCAT prep. So you can also look into some of that stuff as well. Okay, and then this part, this is just notes on, or my notes on the experience of studying for and taking the MCAT overall. The first thing is something I call the n=1 fallacy. You're going to hear a lot of weird stories. You're going to hear about, people saying they got perfect scores without doing any practice. Just if they got that, that's great. Okay. But the goal is to do what's working well for the vast majority of people, right? Which is taking full length exams and practicing and all that stuff. So you can try to also be like an exception and try to replicate what this like one random person on the internet did, or you can play the numbers game and try to replicate what has worked for the vast majority of people who've been successful. So when you hear people give like n=1 strange advice, like I didn't do any practice, or I didn't, I don't know, like I did no content review, it's like, okay, that's great, but I'm going to stick to what's been working for the vast majority of people. On the other side, this is something no one warned me about, but there's a lot of stories, especially on Reddit, where people are like, I did everything perfectly, and then I got like a score in the third percentile. And that can be really discouraging to hear. And I feel very bad for the people that had that experience, but you never get the full story. Okay. So you don't know if they, God forbid, pooped their pants in the middle of the test, or, like when they were like one of my, I wouldn't say like they're a friend, but an acquaintance, like they had a similar story to this. They had like a 526 on like their last full length exam, and their average was like a 519, so really high, and they got under 500 on the real thing. And it's because they never told me that they were like using their phone to look up stuff while they were taking a full length. And it's like, that's obviously completely inflating your score, right? So when you hear stories like this, just feel bad for the, share some nice comments with these people, but like move on from these stories. Don't think it's going to happen to you too, just because you don't have the full information. And then a little bit of self-care stuff. I'm not going to say anything like, don't worry about this test, it doesn't mean much, because I know it means a lot. It's an important test, and it sucks that it's so challenging, but it's just a part of what you have to do. So I'm not going to say that, but what I am going to say is just like, take care of yourself during the process. Something that was super underrated for me that I think no one really mentioned was eating. I've never done anything athletic, so just keep that in mind. But I view this as like almost like a marathon, right? Like if someone's training for an elite athletic event, they're not just doing like the gym training and the athletic training they have to do. They're looking at all other parts of their lives. Like I'm an NBA fan, and NBA players have every aspect of their life very precisely, very clinically controlled, right? They know everything they're doing. And they're not just like shooting hoops all day. They're looking at their body holistically. I don't think our experience studying for this very draining test should be any different. And a big part of that is eating. I think you're going to learn this when you're studying biochem. Your brain goes through a lot of calories, and I don't know why. It's a very common thing. I sometimes do this in college too. During finals week, I would forget to eat or just skip meals for more time. I completely did the opposite during the like 10 weeks I was studying for the MCAT. I didn't start like binging on everything, but I made sure to eat like 3 square meals a day. If I was feeling like having some snacks, I I had some snacks. I had a lot of carbs, honestly. It's quick energy. And my belly, looking down it didn't change too much. I definitely didn't like grow a six pack during the experience, but I didn't like, become extremely unhealthy either. You're just this, again, just take care of yourself, make sure you're feeding yourself. Carbs are a really great way to get some quick energy. So if you're like, if you're an athlete yourself, or if you're like very self-conscious about what you eat, then obviously don't drastically change your eating habits, but just pay attention to it. Just take care of yourself. And it involves the sleep and relaxation stuff as well. So yeah, that's what I've got for you guys. I hope this was helpful. If you have any comments, drop them down. I don't expect this video to get a lot of views, so I should be able to respond to comments individually. And yeah, thank you guys so much.